My friend's mom smiled at me and whispered, "You're blushing already. How sweet." And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about boundaries disappeared. It was late afternoon, and the warm sunlight spilled lazily through the curtains of my friend's living room, casting soft patterns across the floor. I had come over to hang out, nothing more than a casual visit, or so I told myself, but the moment I stepped in, something felt different. She was there, moving with that quiet, effortless grace that immediately drew attention without trying. My friend's mom, 40-something, confident, and impossibly composed, was arranging some books on the shelf, and I found myself noticing the way her hair caught the sunlight, the subtle curve of her smile as she hummed softly to herself. I tried to focus on small talk, on talking to my friend, but my attention kept wandering. There was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet warmth that made the room feel somehow softer, safer. I caught her looking at me once, a fleeting glance that lingered just a heartbeat too long, and my chest tightened before I realized I was blushing. My own reaction surprised me. Why should a simple smile affect me so? And yet, there it was, a flutter of awareness, a nervous thrill I couldn't quite shake. She finally turned toward me fully, and her eyes met mine with a kind of knowing gentleness. "Hello," she said, her voice warm and calm, carrying just a hint of amusement, as if she could already sense my discomfort. There was no judgment in her expression, only curiosity and light-hearted patience. When she smiled again, it felt like a quiet invitation, a subtle acknowledgement that she noticed me noticing her. As I reached for a cup of tea she offered, our fingers brushed. It was brief, accidental, or so I told myself, but the warmth of her hand against mine lingered far longer than necessary. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of embarrassment and something else I couldn't yet name. The room smelled faintly of baked cookies and sunlight through the curtains, a combination that somehow made everything feel more intimate, more alive. I found myself observing the smallest details, the gentle tilt of her head when she laughed, the way her hand lingered near the books as she shifted them, the softness in her eyes even as she carried herself with quiet authority. And somewhere between these moments, a quiet curiosity began to grow inside me, a tentative awareness that maybe, just maybe, I was standing on the edge of something I hadn't expected, a connection that didn't follow the usual rules of my age or experience. By the time I left that evening, the memory of her smile, the brush of her hand, and the calm steadiness of her presence had settled into me like sunlight warming a cool room. And though I didn't know it yet, that small, fleeting interaction was the first thread in a story neither of us could have anticipated, one that would unfold slowly, tenderly, and in ways that would linger long after the door closed behind me. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh coffee and something sweet baking in the oven, a comforting mix that made the room feel smaller, warmer, and, somehow more intimate. I was helping clean up the counter after my friend had gone to answer a call, fumbling with a plate and a towel, feeling every bit the awkward young man I was. She leaned against the counter across from me, arms crossed loosely, a small smile playing on her lips as she watched me struggle. "You're blushing already," she said suddenly, tilting her head, her tone light but laced with a playful curiosity. "How sweet." I froze mid-motion, the plate in my hand suddenly heavier than it had been a second ago. Her words sent a flutter through my chest, that same quickened pulse I'd felt earlier, only stronger this time, heavier with awareness. I tried to meet her gaze but found myself looking down at the counter, pretending to focus on drying the plate. My ears felt warm, my hands shaking slightly, not from the dish, but from the electricity in her presence. She stepped closer to hand me a cup of coffee, and for the briefest moment, our fingers brushed. It was casual, accidental, or at least she made it seem so, but the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than necessary. My breath hitched without me realizing it, and I could feel her watching me, silently aware of the effect she had. "I think you're overthinking it," she added softly, a laugh tugging at the corner of her lips. But it wasn't dismissive, it was knowing, teasing, and tender all at once. There was a quiet power in the way she observed me, not judging, not mocking, just noticing. And somehow, that made my nervous excitement feel both thrilling and grounding at the same time. I caught myself stealing glances at her, the curve of her neck as she leaned to reach for a jar, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the gentle sway of her hair as she moved. Everything she did seemed effortless, graceful, yet it held my attention entirely, pulling me into a silent orbit I didn't want to escape. The kitchen, filled with mundane tasks and everyday scents, had transformed into a space charged with quiet tension. Each casual brush of hands, each playful glance, lingered, unspoken but full of promise. I felt a mix of embarrassment and exhilaration, caught between wanting to retreat and longing to lean closer, to see how far this gentle teasing could go. By the time I handed her the last dish, our fingers had touched several times, always fleeting, never deliberate, yet always leaving a lingering warmth. And as I stepped back to take a breath, I realized with a quiet jolt that I was no longer just visiting my friend's house. I was standing on the edge of something far more complicated, far more intoxicating, and entirely unplanned, a slow, delicate pull towards someone I shouldn't be noticing, yet couldn't stop thinking about. The rain had started softly against the windows, tapping a gentle rhythm that made the living room feel like a small, cozy world apart from everything else. I found myself sinking into the couch, a warm mug of tea cradled in my hands, while she sat across from me, her presence calm and grounded. There was a quiet ease to the way she moved, the kind of natural confidence that made everything she did seem deliberate and yet effortlessly graceful. She began to talk about something from her past, a story that was both light-hearted and tinged with a subtle melancholy. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, and I listened closely, drawn in not just by the story but by the way she told it, the careful pauses, the small smiles, the way her eyes glimmered as she remembered. I realized that in telling this story, she was letting me into a part of herself that not many people saw. For a moment, I felt brave enough to share a little of my own insecurities, the quiet worries I usually kept to myself. I spoke hesitantly, my words low, almost as if I were confessing a secret to the rain itself. And she listened, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a gentle attentiveness that made my chest loosen in relief. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly, resting her hand lightly on the edge of mine, not quite touching but close enough that I felt the warmth radiate across the small space between us. The room smelled of damp earth from the rain outside, mixed with the faint sweetness of the tea and the lingering scent of cookies from earlier. The ambient sounds, the soft patter of rain, the distant hum of the city, made everything feel suspended in a quiet bubble, private and intimate. Her smile when she noticed my nervous glances was small, knowing, and somehow incredibly reassuring. "You don't have to be nervous with me," she said, her voice warm and steady. That simple statement, combined with her relaxed posture and the way her fingers brushed against the mug as she reached for it, made my heart swell with a quiet, unexpected longing. I realized, sitting there across from her, that this wasn't just curiosity or fleeting attraction. There was something deeper at play, a growing sense of trust, of being seen, of emotional connection that bypassed age, expectations, and social boundaries. Every glance, every slight gesture, every soft laugh we shared added another layer to a delicate tension that was building quietly between us. By the time the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, I felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in how I regarded her. She was no longer just my friend's mom, a figure from my social circle. She had become someone I wanted to know more deeply, someone whose presence made the world feel simultaneously safer and more thrilling. In that shared vulnerability, I began to understand that this slow-burn connection was just beginning, and it already felt impossible to ignore. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, the soft hum of the ceiling fan blending with the faint ticking of the clock. We were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner together. Plates and utensils clinked softly as we washed and dried, the ordinary sounds of the task oddly grounding in the warmth of the dimly lit room. I tried to focus on the dishes, to stay busy, but every movement she made seemed to pull my attention back to her, the graceful way she reached for a glass, the gentle sway of her hair as she leaned over the sink. Our hands brushed more than once while passing dishes or wiping counters. Each touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet each left a lingering warmth that spread across my skin. My chest tightened with each brush, and I found myself stealing glances at her, trying to gauge whether she felt the same subtle tension I did. When our eyes met over the sink, the moment stretched, suspended in silence. I could see a flicker of recognition in her gaze, an acknowledgement of something unspoken yet undeniably present between us. She leaned slightly closer to reach a plate on the top shelf, and her hair brushed against my shoulder. It was such a simple, mundane movement, but the effect on me was electric. I could feel my pulse quicken, a mixture of exhilaration and nervous anticipation that I had never expected to feel in a kitchen during such an ordinary task. There was no need for words, the silence between us carried more weight than any conversation could. The kitchen smelled faintly of the dinner we had shared, a comforting mixture of herbs and warm dishes, mingling with the subtle floral scent of her perfume. The combination made the space feel intimate, private, a small world that existed solely between the two of us. I became acutely aware of the sound of her breathing, the rhythm of her movements, the way her eyes met mine whenever our hands passed close. Every small gesture carried a tension that both frightened and thrilled me. For the first time, I recognized the depth of my feelings, not just attraction, but an almost magnetic pull toward her presence, toward her warmth and the quiet steadiness she exuded. And in her glances, in the subtle smiles she allowed herself when our fingers brushed, I sensed that she, too, might be aware of the fragile thread weaving between us. By the time the last dish was dried and put away, I realized how completely absorbed I had become by her presence. Something unspoken had shifted, the ordinary had become charged, the mundane transformed into something tender and electric. And though we said nothing about it, I knew, without doubt, that our connection had deepened, silently, irresistibly, in the simple intimacy of a shared task. Later that night, the world outside was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. We had moved to the backyard, sitting on the wooden bench under the soft glow of the porch lights. The air was cool, carrying the faint fragrance of blooming flowers and freshly dampened earth from the earlier rain. It was the kind of night that made everything feel more intimate, more suspended in time, as if the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. I found myself unusually aware of her presence, the way she shifted slightly to get comfortable, the subtle tilt of her head as she looked at me. My chest tightened, a mix of nervousness and anticipation. I wanted to speak, to voice the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind, yet I hesitated, unsure how, or if, I should. After all, she was my friend's mother, older, wise, and poised in a way I barely knew how to navigate. And yet, the pull toward her was undeniable. I cleared my throat and let a quiet confession slip out, almost as if I were admitting it to the night itself. I enjoy spending time with you. More than I thought I would. The words felt small, almost inadequate, but I had spoken them, and now the vulnerability lingered in the air between us. She turned to look at me, her expression soft, and I felt the weight of her gaze in the best possible way. There was no judgment, no surprise, only a gentle acknowledgement that seemed to say, I understand. Her hand reached out lightly, brushing against my shoulder, a fleeting touch that sent a rush of warmth straight through me. It was careful, deliberate, and yet understated, a gesture that communicated more than words ever could. I notice you too, she said quietly, her voice steady but warm. More than you realize. She smiled, the kind of smile that made my heart beat faster and slower all at once, full of reassurance and quiet encouragement. The tension between us was electric but unspoken, carried in the subtle shifts of posture, the accidental closeness when our knees brushed, the way her hand lingered just near mine on the bench. Every small movement, every glance, held meaning, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the thrill of being seen, understood, and somehow invited into a delicate intimacy. By the end of the night, I knew that the connection we shared had shifted. Hesitation remained, certainly, and the world outside still imposed its boundaries, but we had acknowledged something undeniable. The pull between us was no longer quiet curiosity or fleeting attraction, it was real, mutual, and quietly intoxicating. And as I looked at her one last time before leaving, the warmth of her presence lingered with me, a promise of moments yet to come, tender and impossible to ignore. The rain had returned that evening, soft and steady, drumming a gentle rhythm against the windows. We were curled up on the couch, wrapped in a thick, cozy blanket, the world outside fading into a blur of wet streets and distant lights. The room smelled of warm tea and the lingering aroma of dinner, a comforting cocoon that seemed to exist solely for the two of us. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge the depth of my feelings. It wasn't just admiration, attraction, or curiosity, it was a profound connection, a quiet recognition of someone who saw me in ways no one else did. My heart thumped with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. Was it possible, I wondered, to feel so drawn to someone who occupied such a different world from my own? She noticed the tension in my posture and the hesitant way I stared at the flickering light from the rain-streaked window. Without a word, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. The contact was gentle, intentional, yet entirely non-intrusive. It sent a warmth through me, grounding my racing thoughts and filling the space between us with an unspoken understanding. "I know this isn't simple," she said softly, her voice steady yet tinged with vulnerability. "I know what people might think, but I also know how I feel." Her hand rested lightly on my knee now, a touch that was intimate but completely safe. Every brush of her fingers communicated reassurance, acceptance, and the quiet thrill of closeness. I took a shaky breath, letting the words I had been holding back finally surface. "I feel the same way. I don't know how or why, but I can't ignore it." My voice was low, hesitant, yet filled with sincerity. She smiled, that warm, knowing smile that had captivated me from the very beginning. "Then we'll take it slowly," she said, her thumb brushing gently across my hand. "We'll figure this out together." The weight of her words, combined with her steady, comforting presence, lifted a tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The blanket wrapped around us seemed to hold more than warmth, it held our shared vulnerability, the quiet thrill of acknowledgement, and a deep sense of trust. We stayed close, talking softly, laughing quietly at little things, sharing moments of silence that were as meaningful as the words. In that gentle intimacy, I realized that we had reached a turning point. Hesitation remained, certainly, and the world outside our cocoon still imposed its rules. But in that moment, there was nothing but understanding, acceptance, and the thrill of a connection that neither of us wanted to deny. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet certainty that this slow-burn connection was real, mutual, and safe, ready to grow at its own deliberate pace. The next morning arrived softly, the sun casting a gentle glow across the garden. Dew sparkled on the grass, and the air was crisp, filled with the quiet scent of flowers and freshly turned earth. We sat together on the porch, wrapped in light sweaters, sharing a moment of calm that felt suspended in time. The world outside continued as usual, but for a few precious hours, it was as if the universe had narrowed to just the two of us. We sipped our coffee slowly, the warmth from the mug seeping into our hands, and I found myself watching her more closely than I probably should have. There was a quiet contentment in her eyes, a softness to her smile that seemed to reflect the late-night conversations, the playful teasing, and the intimate silences we had shared. I realized, with a mixture of awe and relief, that our connection had found its natural place, not rushed, not forced, but steady, warm, and undeniably real. Her hand brushed against mine as she reached for her mug, a gentle touch that lingered longer than necessary. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the warmth of her skin sink into mine, letting the familiarity and quiet affection of that touch fill the empty spaces in my chest. It was subtle, ordinary in action, yet extraordinary in feeling, a simple confirmation that our bond had grown into something deeply personal, something that could be cherished without words. We talked about small, everyday things, plans for the day, minor errands, jokes shared between friends, but each word carried the weight of our shared history over the past few days. Each glance, each brush of our fingers, carried meaning. The age difference that once seemed like a potential obstacle now felt almost irrelevant. What mattered was the trust, the laughter, and the quiet moments of vulnerability that had knit us together in ways neither of us had anticipated. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, her hand brushing against mine again as she reached to steady herself. That touch, familiar now and reassuring, sent a gentle warmth through me. I met her eyes, and she met mine with the same knowing, affectionate gaze that had started everything, the same gaze that had first made my heart skip a beat weeks ago. As the sun climbed higher, we remained on the porch, enjoying the simplicity of the morning. I realized, sitting there beside her, that this was the conclusion of our slow-burn journey, not a dramatic declaration or sweeping gesture, but a quiet, authentic understanding. We were connected, truly and deeply, and that connection was enough. For the first time, I felt completely at peace with it. The blushes, the stolen glances, the lingering touches, they all culminated in this serene, tender moment. And as we watched the world wake up around us, I knew that our story, though unconventional in many ways, had reached a satisfying, beautiful resolution, a slow-burn connection turned into something quietly everlasting. If you enjoyed this story and the slow-burn journey between them, make sure to follow and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the next tale of love, tension, and unexpected connections. Hit that button and join